Could I have your attention, please? I'd like to welcome you today to this presentation by Dr. James Alexander. As you know, he is a psychologist in his third decade of practice and holds a PhD in clinical health psychology. He specialises in the psychological treatment of chronic pain and trauma and is here today discussing his recent publication, The Hidden Psychology of Pain. Thanks, James.
Well, thank you, David, and thanks for the opportunity to talk here today. My interest in working with chronic pain, I guess, really began when I was 18 years old and I was nearly killed in a head-on car accident in which a drunk driver slammed into the front of my car. Even though I was passing in and out of consciousness, I was told that I had been trapped in the car for 2.5 hours before they could free me from it. And during that 2.5 hours, I lost a lot of blood. I had bones sticking out of my body from multiple fractures. As you can imagine, being trapped in the car wreck was a highly traumatizing experience. It took me probably around 6 months to physically recover from the physical injuries that I sustained from the accident. And around the time when I began to physically recover, I also began a psychological recovery. As luck would have it, I discovered the self-help psychology books in my father's library, which had been there probably throughout my entire childhood and adolescence. But until that point in time, I really had no reason to investigate these further. After my car accident, I was highly traumatized. In hindsight, I can see that I plunged into fairly deep despair and depression. The label PTSD was never applied to me, but in hindsight, I think that it probably should have been. And all this began to change around 6 months later when I began to physically recover from the injuries. I'd spent around 6 months on crutches and having to use a walking stick. And around the 6-month mark, I began to physically recover where I no longer needed crutches or a walking stick. And as I said, it was around this time that I discovered these self-help psychology books in my father's library. And I began to both physically and emotionally recover from the experience. Around 1.5 years after the accident, so we'd say probably 12 months after I began to psychologically recover, I had an experience of using a ride-on lawnmower and bending and twisting to ensure that things like rocks, etc., weren't in the next track of what I was wanting to mow. And while using this bent and twisted, I felt a clunking sensation in the base of my back. It wasn't painful, but it was certainly noticeable. And when I stood up probably an hour later, I felt a tearing pain in my left groin, and it felt very much like a torn groin muscle. I expected this pain to not last for terribly long. However, it did last. In fact, the pain stayed with me for the next 18 years. Over the course of the next couple of months, as the pain wasn't going away, I sought help from, firstly, a physiotherapist who suggested that the pain was resulting from a displacement of vertebra in my lower back, which she believed probably happened as a result of the head-on car accident that I'd had 1.5 years earlier. And she believed that the displacement of vertebra was pinching a nerve in my lower back, which was sending a referent pain into my left groin. This seemed to be a fairly plausible explanation, particularly in light of the fact that my body had been traumatized through the car accident, particularly the impact of two cars meeting at a particular speed. And in fact, when I came out of hospital, my mother sent me along to a chiropractor who assessed that, yes, I did have various vertebrae out of place as a result of the car accident. So, a year and a half later, I was in pain in my left groin, consulting with a physiotherapist, and she provided that explanation. She had me lay in traction each time I went to see her, probably for about half an hour at a time, with the idea being that the traction would pull the offending vertebra apart and therefore take the pressure off the nerve which was sending a referred pain into my left groin. And I must say that as long as I was in the traction, this felt pretty good. The pain eased up and it all seemed to be working quite well. The problem was the pain would usually resume fairly quickly after the end of the consultation. In fact, it was usually when I was getting back into my car in the physiotherapist's car park that the pain would shoot back into my left groin again, virtually 5 minutes after coming out of the traction. So the pain went on. My next option was to see a well-regarded chiropractor in my area. And he believed that as a result of my car accident, there was a twist in my hips, which was also pinching a nerve, sending a referred pain into my left groin. And his treatment was to have me lay on 2 blocks, one underneath my left upper thigh and the other one underneath my right hip, with the idea being that my own weight would settle on these blocks and correct the twist in my hip, therefore alleviating the pressure on the offending nerve. And I found that, again, sure enough, as long as I was laying on the blocks and my hip was being twisted in this manner, that there was an alleviation of the pain, which I certainly appreciated. He also did some spinal manipulation, as is normal for chiropractors. Before too long, I realised that if I just made my own blocks, I could replicate his treatment at home, which is exactly what I did. And so on most days, I would seek relief in the evening by laying down on my own blocks and correcting the twist in my hips and alleviating the pain. Again, it was only ever temporary in that the pain never actually went away. It could be temporarily alleviated by laying on these blocks, but I remained in pain. Now, the pain was variable in that there were some days where I felt really quite okay and the pain was only there as a slight twinge, to such an extent that I could run quite easily and I could even play tennis. However, there were other days when it was difficult for me to simply walk, and even very simple actions such as opening a door or getting into my car could lead to a very real increase in the pain. If I was working physically for a living, there was probably half the time that I would have been unable to work. The other half of the time, my guess is I would have been fine. Now, this pain lasted for me for 18 years, and it wasn't until I was in my late 30s that I came across the notion that psychological factors could be a contributing factor to chronic pain such as I was experiencing. And I first came across this notion from a book which a friend lent me, titled Spontaneous Healing by American physician Dr. Andrew Weil, W-E-I-L. And in this book he referred to a Professor John Sarno, who's a professor of rehabilitation medicine at New York University Hospital, who was making fairly astounding claims to being able to resolve people's chronic pain simply through a psychoeducational program. And the psychoeducational program involved primarily information in the form of 2 seminar presentations that he gave to his patients. And each of these seminar presentations went for around 45 minutes, during which Professor Sarno would convey to people in the audience his theory of what was producing chronic pain. When I read about Dr. Sarno, I started to look into the history of this particular notion that psychological factors could play a causal role in producing chronic pain. And I discovered that he was actually basing his theory and approach on the work of a Hungarian psychoanalyst called Franz Alexander, no relation to me as far as I'm aware. Franz Alexander was a neo-psychoanalyst and part of the second generation of European psychoanalysts. And he began popularising his approach to working primarily with chronic illnesses, not so much chronic pain, but he was focusing on chronic illnesses in the 30s and 40s. It was in the late 30s that he went to America and became the chair of psychosomatic medicine at the University of Chicago. And Professor Alexander was articulating his psychological approach to working with chronic illness in the 30s, 40s and 50s. After he died in the 1960s, it appears to me that his ideas were fairly quickly forgotten, certainly by mainstream medical practice, and really wasn't until Professor Sarno rediscovered his notions in the early 70s that Franz Alexander became even known about again. Around the same time, in the 1950s and 60s, the rise of medical technology was beginning to really take off. So all sorts of stunning advances in medical technology was evolving during this time, and it would have been very hard for people to not be incredibly impressed by these advances in medical technology. We've now arrived at a point where people can have heart transplants, lung transplants, etc. Digits and limbs can be sewn back on with microsurgery. The amount of computer-assisted medical technology is absolutely phenomenal. And as I said, it's very hard not to be impressed by these advances. I think what happened to us as a culture is that due to these advances in medical science and medical technology, as a culture, we were basically seduced into a technological approach to conceptualizing the human organism as well as medical and psychological care. So I think this is partly part of the explanation as to why Professor Franz Alexander's ideas sank into relative obscurity. As I said, this was until the early 70s when Professor Sarno came across Franz Alexander's notions of psychological factors having a large role to play in the causation of chronic illnesses. And he began to apply these ideas to chronic pain. Being professor of rehab medicine, he was being confronted with multiple people every day that were in chronic pain. And it didn't take long for Professor Sarno to work out that conventional medical practice had very little to offer these people. As a result, he was motivated to look into the medical literature history and to find who had successfully worked with such issues in the past and get a handle on what it is that they'd actually been doing that had helped sufferers of chronic conditions. And this is where he came across Professor Franz Alexander's work. When I started working or started utilising what John Sarno was saying, I began with a book that he'd written called Healing Back Pain. Now, as the title suggests, healing back pain is primarily about chronic back pain, but also talks about chronic neck and shoulder pain. In this book, he presents the theory that psychological factors play a causal role in producing chronic pain experiences. Now, I read this book quite a few times in the first 3 months. In fact, I really soaked myself in what he had to say, really trying to absorb his messages. In fact, I got hold of Healing Back Pain on audiobook cassettes, and for about 3 months, that's all I listened to in my car as I was driving to and from work. So I really absorbed myself in the ideas of what he was proposing. What puzzled me, however, was that I was experiencing a groin pain, not a back, neck or shoulder pain. And as a result, there was a question mark in my head as to whether what Professor Sarno was saying actually applied to me or not. I couldn't find any reference in this book, Healing Back Pain, to groin pain. And being in a different country, it was obviously quite difficult for me to have any contact with Professor Sarno. So I was really just struggling on my own to try to work out whether his ideas were actually applicable to my pain scenario or not. I really wasn't quite sure. But I was interested in the proposition. And in fact, the whole proposition was a startling revelation to me. Up until that time, I had considered myself to be a reasonably standard cognitive behavioural psychologist, simply as a result of the education that I'd had in psychology and the socialisation experience, part of which involved, I think, a large dismissal of depth psychology notions. The cognitive behavioural paradigm, as you may know, really focuses on the conscious thoughts that we're using to make sense of our experience. And it really doesn't utilise a notion of the unconscious mind at all. And in fact, it really just focuses on the conscious mind as being both the seat of our problems in terms of the thoughts that we use to make sense of our experience, but also the place of potential solution. If we can change our thoughts about ourselves, about the world, about our experiences, then the idea is that this will have a flow-on effect to changed emotions and changed behaviour, and that is where the solution lies. This is the type of psychology that I was well and truly trained in and had been practicing for all of my career up to that point as a psychologist. I never gave any second thought to the notion of there being an unconscious mind. In fact, I think at that point in my career, I viewed it as being a fairly outdated myth that had no real value in actually helping people to get better. So when I came across Professor Sarno's and before him Professor Alexander's ideas and their model, which was focused primarily on unconscious factors, it really was a startling revelation to me. And I think it allowed me to get back in touch with the legacy of much of psychology that was operating before the cognitive behavioural revolution. Anyway, back to my story and my experience. I really wasn't quite sure whether Professor Sarno's ideas applied to me or not. Then, at around this time, I was taking my family on a holiday back to Queensland, back to the part of Queensland, in fact, where my car accident had happened as an 18-year-old. I was going back there 20 years later. Now, as an 18-year-old, I came from Melbourne, and my goal for a couple of years before turning 18 was to buy a Kombi and to travel around Australia. And that's what I started to do. I spent a couple of months living and working in Sydney. I travelled up to the Gold Coast, where I spent a couple of months working. And then I travelled to the Sunshine Coast and had, I think it was 1 or 2 nights at Noosa Heads before my car accident happened. 20 years later, I was taking my family for a holiday to the Sunshine Coast. And of course, I'd raised my 3 children with the story about me nearly being killed in a car accident. And as we were going to be in the same part of the country, everybody wanted to go back to the accident site to see where this accident had happened and basically get back to the place where I hadn't died. And I must say that I was quite interested in doing that as well. 20 years later, it felt like a psychologically safe thing to do. we spent probably about 4 or 5 days in Brisbane before going up to the Sunshine Coast, and we wanted to take the kids around to the tourist attractions in Brisbane. And as the days went on, the level of pain in my left groin became so intense that it turned out I could barely walk. It felt like I was literally dragging my left leg behind me. I can't explain the pain other than to say that it felt like probably a 4-inch knife had been thrust into my left groin and twisted. It was extremely painful. It was highly debilitating at this point over these few days. It was the highest level of disability that I'd experienced from it over the course of the 18 years that I'd had the pain, and it's the highest level of pain that I'd experienced as well. And as I said, it reached a point where it felt like I was literally just dragging my left leg behind me. The next day or so, we went to Noosa Heads, and I found the accident site. And while I was standing there, I felt emotionally okay about being there. It didn't seem to be re-traumatising. But in the moment of standing there, it actually occurred to me that I was within a day or two of the anniversary of the accident. And that was just purely random luck. When I was planning my holiday, I had no real awareness of the anniversary of the accident. But when I was standing there at the accident site, it occurred to me I was within a day or two of the anniversary date of the accident. And here I was standing in the place where I'd nearly been killed as an 18-year-old in fairly grisly circumstances, where I'd been trapped in a car wreck for 2.5 hours, basically bleeding to death, with multiple injuries, multiple fractures, going through the emotional trauma of being trapped from the waist down in a car that had collapsed in on my legs, people trying to break open the car, probably 15 to 20 people standing around the site of the car accident, around the car wreck. Some women amongst these people basically going hysterical, screaming for men to try to get me out, seeing that I was dying. Knowing that I was in the process of dying and passing in and out of consciousness in extreme pain. And every time I woke up from being unconscious, again having the dawning awareness that I was trapped in a car accident, in a car wreck, in a very bad state, possibly dying, thrashing about, trying to release myself, and eventually collapsing in exhaustion and despair and giving up, knowing that I wasn't going to get out. So here I was 20 years later, around the same date, in the same place, and it occurred to me that the pain that I was experiencing in my left groin was the worst that I'd ever experienced. And all of a sudden, it really seemed to be no coincidence at all that the pain was the most intense that I'd ever felt it. All of a sudden, the pain that I felt in my groin no longer seemed to be a random physical event, but it very much appeared now to be a meaningful event that was highly related to the emotional trauma that I'd experienced, and probably not actually related to the physical trauma that I'd experienced. Physically, my body had recovered, let's say, 19 years earlier, in that the bones that had been snapped in half had healed back together perfectly, and I had no real physical ongoing injury. My body had done the healing work as our bodies tend to do. However, the emotional trauma that I experienced was still there, and just because I managed to largely turn my back on it and ignore it and almost get on with my life in a pretense that the trauma had never happened, really didn't mean that the trauma ever went away. In fact, the trauma remained, I believe, at a fairly deep level, at a fairly unconscious level, which is exactly where I pushed it. On a conscious level, I was focused on wanting to get on with my life in the best way that I could. After discovering self-help psychology books and reading those voraciously, I decided that I wanted to be a psychologist so that I could help other people that had been similarly traumatised as I had. And I embarked on many years of study and training in order to become a psychologist. And then practicing as a psychologist and basically getting on with my life in the best way that I knew how, which certainly didn't mean indulging in the memory of my trauma or of my car accident, and in a sense trying to, at a certain level, trying to pretend that the accident never happened. Obviously I knew that it had happened, but I was not going to give it any real psychological time or energy with any focus whatsoever. And as a new cognitive behavioural psychologist, I believe that all I really needed to do was to tell myself adaptive, constructive, realistic, rational things, and any emotional problems associated with the traumatic experience would basically go away. And I guess you could say on a certain level this worked, in that I did manage to get on with my life and constructively recovered from the trauma to a certain extent. However, I had no awareness of a level of trauma that was still obviously operating within me at a fairly deep unconscious level. That is, until I was at the accident site 20 years later, and I noticed that, well, not that I noticed, it occurred to me, the penny finally dropped, that the physical pain that I'd been experiencing for 20 years was highly related to the emotional trauma that I'd experienced in the car accident and had successfully managed to bury for 20 years. Now, the pain didn't go away in that moment. As I said, the penny dropped, and it all of a sudden made a whole lot of sense to me. And it made a whole lot of sense to me regardless of whether Professor Sono was talking about groin pain or not. I was at a point where I didn't need to follow his cues that were in his books. It seemed self-evident to me from my own body and my own experience that my pain was resulting from emotional trauma, even though the pain was in my left groin and not in my back or my neck or my shoulders. Over the course of the next few days, the pain began to diminish. By the end of the following week, the pain had gone away, and I'm pleased to say that the pain has never come back again. That happened to me, the pain went away when I was 38, 20 years after my car accident. I was well and truly into my career as a psychologist by that time. In fact, I was working with a lot of people that were in chronic pain. And as a result of my pain going away, I became really quite enthusiastic about using this approach, this model, and began to introduce these ideas to many of my clients that were also suffering from chronic pain. And what I saw amongst them, if I offered these ideas tentatively as a set of options or as an approach, as a model for them to consider, then what I saw was that many of my clients also managed to get over their chronic pain. And again, this was an enormous breakthrough in that up until that point in time, there's nothing that I had seen that psychology could do, or medicine, or physiotherapy, or chiropractic, or therapeutic massage, or anything could do that was meeting with the same kind of success that I was seeing in many of my clients that were getting over their chronic pain as a result of using the approach that I'm going to describe to you today. So naturally I became even more enthusiastic about this whole approach and even more confident that I was onto something very important here. As I grew up in Melbourne in the 1960s and 70s, Australian rules football was and has been accurately described as a form of religion there. And like just about all other kids that grew up in Melbourne during the same era, I grew up playing Aussie rules football. Of course, I stopped playing as a result of my car accident when I was 18. I'd snapped my femur and my tibia in half and fractured the other shin bone, and I'd also fractured an ankle. And as a result of my accident, the injuries, I believed that my body was fragile and weak and vulnerable. And I basically spent 20 years not quite wrapping myself up in cotton wool, but certainly not exerting myself in any vigorous manner. And the whole idea of playing football again was just not really a possibility. At the age of 38, when my body became pain-free, and I became extremely enthusiastic about the approach that Professor Sarno was describing, and I saw a lot of my clients getting better as well. In a fit of madness, I decided that I'd like to play football again. And the town that I lived nearest in that year actually created a football team, an Aussie Rules football team, and it happened to be the Demons, and the team that I grew up barracking for were the Melbourne Demons, and the local Demons wore the same jumpers, and I saw this as my last opportunity in life to wear a Demons jumper playing football again. And as I said, in a fit of madness, I decided I would play again, and I turned up to the football ground one Saturday and introduced myself to the coach, told him I hadn't played for a few years. Didn't mention that it had actually been 20 years since I played. Being a country football team, they're always in need of more players, so I managed to start on the field at the beginning of the match, and had basically a sensational time. Within the first 10 seconds or so, the ball came down my way onto the field. I went up in a pack, came down with the ball in my hands, took a mark, and had a shot at goal. In landing with this pack, I landed with several other players on top of me, and over the course of that game, I was basically knocked around from pillar to post by a bunch of my opponents that were mostly in their 20s and fairly well built, strong young men that were vigorous and fit and healthy. And here I was at the age of 38, somewhat skinny, having not exerted my body in the previous 20 years, and certainly not as fast as what I was when I was 18. And as I said, I got belted around from pillar to post, and every time I was hit by one of these burly 20-something-year-olds on my left side, I would land with an equal force on the ground on my right side. And it took me a few of these experiences to realise that my body was actually really quite strong and resilient, even though I had been injured 20 years earlier. And again, this was a startling revelation to me. As a result of the enjoyment that I had in discovering that my body was in fact strong and resilient, and that it wasn't weak and fragile as I'd been led to believe for the previous 20 years, I went on to play 7 seasons of football, and had an absolute blast every time I ran onto the football field, even though I was getting knocked around fairly substantially. My groin pain never came back as a result of playing football, and I pushed my body as hard as I could possibly push it in terms of training vigorously and playing as vigorously as I possibly could. And that was now around 14 years ago. And the pain that had been a constant companion in my life for the previous 18 years has never come back, other than a very slight occasional reminder that I can sometimes feel. And whenever this happens, it's always in the context of emotional stuff going on for me. It has never happened as a result of anything that I've done physically. And so the relationship between what's going on for me emotionally or psychologically and my physical experience has just been reinforced by the very few occasions where I've had a slight tweak of the same kind of pain as a very faint reminder of what it had been. So that's my personal story. as I said, when I had this experience, I became very enthusiastic about introducing these ideas to other people. And over the course of the years since then, I've seen many people also get over chronic pain that they'd experienced for many years. And some of these people have been, in fact, many of these people have been a lot more disabled than what I ever was. Some of these people were basically crippled by chronic back pain. And in my book, I describe a client of mine who I've called Max. Max was a man in his mid-40s when I met him. At the time, I was working in the chronic pain unit of a hospital. And Max presented as a person that had been in chronic back pain for the previous 5 years. And his life for those previous 5 years had basically involved moving between his bed and his lounge room couch. He'd had to leave work 5 years earlier. He was so disabled by the pain that he was unable to do anything physical other than literally move between his couch and his bed. As you'd expect, he was extremely depressed by what his life had become. He was on antidepressants. He was entertaining a lot of suicidal ideation and feeling suicidal a lot. He figured that he'd failed as a husband, he'd failed to be a provider, and he'd failed as a father. He had 2 young children. He'd never been able to get on the ground and play with his children. He'd never been able to hold his children while standing up, as he could hold no weight whatsoever. He'd never been able to kick a ball with his children or play with them in any meaningful way. So his life was an absolute misery, and every moment of every day was consumed by excruciating pain. He's probably the most disabled person that I've worked with in terms of chronic pain. The second time that I met with him, I introduced to him the psychological model of chronic pain, with the suggestion that emotional distress operating at an unconscious level can in fact be a causal factor in producing and maintaining chronic pain. I'll elaborate on this theory a whole lot more during the course of today, so that you'll get a better understanding of what I'm proposing here. But I detailed this notion to Max over the course of the second session. He listened quietly, occasionally nodding, not saying much at all. He didn't ask any questions at the end of the session. He said that he'd go away and think about what I'd put to him. When I saw him the week after, this is the third meeting that I had with him, he revealed to me that throughout most of his childhood he'd been sexually abused by his older brother. The only times when the sexual abuse didn't happen was when he spent weekends at his auntie's place, and for some reason only he went to his auntie's place and his older brother didn't go. He'd never spoken to anybody about the sexual abuse. He'd never revealed it to anybody. He'd told his wife that should he die unexpectedly in an accident, maybe at a time when he was feeling suicidal, to be wary of the brother and to never allow the brother to have unsupervised access to his children. He wanted to protect them in the event that he died. He didn't tell his wife why that was the case. His father had died earlier, well, during Max's adulthood, and only his mother was alive. He'd never told his father while he was alive, and he felt that if he told his elderly mother that the sexual abuse had happened, it would be extremely harmful for her and could in fact actually kill her. The shock of it could kill her. As it turned out, the brother was now living with the elderly mother in order to look after her. There was a whole lot of quandaries that were going on for Max, a whole lot of dilemmas that had no easy answer to them. And Max told me about the sexual abuse by way of wondering out loud whether this could in fact be playing a role in the causation and the maintenance of his chronic back pain. To which I replied, yes, I thought it could very well be playing a very significant role. I asked Max what was going on in his life at the time when the chronic pain started. Now, he'd been working in a vocation that involved a fair degree of heavy lifting. As many people with chronic back pain find, when they have scans or x-rays, they find that, sure enough, there are sites of disc pathology, disc bulges or protrusions or extrusions, etc., which most GPs and even specialists view as being causally related or responsible for the chronic back pain. And sure enough, like a normal man over the age of 40, Max had several sites of disc pathology at the time that were found when the pain started. Now, the importance of disc pathology really only extends as far as explaining acute pain. When we have an injury that results in a disc pathology, it's quite likely that we're going to experience an acute pain as a result of that injury. There's inflammation around that site of injury, of the soft tissue injury, and basically the pain is our body's mechanism to ensure that we stay relatively still and we protect that injured part of our body so as to allow the body to do the physical recovery work, to do the healing work. The reality is that discs never heal to the extent that they become unbulged ever again, so that damage never actually goes away, but the inflammation will eventually settle down, and with it the pain for most people will actually settle down as well. Now, it may be that at any time over his adulthood and his working life, Max had injuries which resulted in these disc pathologies. And it may also be that when this chronic pain started, of course it began as an acute pain, and it may be that it began with an actual injury from heavy lifting in which he caused a disc pathology. And it may actually be that the disc pathology occurred months or years earlier, and it may not be related at all to this particular onset of pain. There's no way of knowing that, really. At any rate, Max told me that when the pain started, two very significant events in his life happened. The first significant event was that his brother got a job in the same workplace, the brother that had sexually abused him throughout most of his childhood. This brother got a job in the same workplace, and everybody, in particular his mother, thought what a wonderful thing it was that two brothers would wind up in the same workplace. And wasn't that a wonderful thing? What this meant for Max was that on a daily basis he was now being confronted by his sexual abuser. Now, Max had an ambivalent relationship with his brother in that he maintained a normal social relationship with him. Once a week he'd go around for dinner at his mum's place, where he would see his brother and have dinner with him, with his family. And oddly enough, he also would go along to football matches every week with his brother. They were members of a club and they had regular seats, and every week they would go along and sit with each other to watch football matches. So on a surface level, you could say that Max had a fairly normal kind of relationship with his brother. But it's quite plausible that at a much deeper level than the surface level, there was an enormous amount of anger and hostility and resentment that he felt towards his brother. In fact, it's even plausible that at some level, he may have wanted to kill his brother as a result of what he put him throughout his entire childhood. Max was not aware of any such feelings. He knew that he disliked what his brother had done to him. And in fact, he'd only ever confronted him once during his 20s, at a time when Max was drunk. He confronted his brother about the sexual abuse. His brother didn't say anything but retreated from the interaction in tears. And that was the end of the exchange around the sexual abuse. There'd been no other time in Max's life when he'd actually confronted his brother about it. So it's quite possible that on a surface level, Max was maintaining a regular relationship with his brother, but on a much deeper level, there was an enormous degree of not only trauma, but resentment, hatred, rage, and maybe even a murderous anger towards him. Now, the other significant thing that happened to Max at the time when the chronic pains began for him was that his first child was born. And immediately Max could see how vulnerable a little newborn child was. And of course, this was a trigger for him to, at some level, in combination with his brother turning up the same workplace, was a trigger for his own trauma, because he knew what could happen to vulnerable little people. And all of a sudden, Max felt entirely responsible for the safety and welfare of his newborn baby, a vulnerable little person, at the same time as the perpetrator was coming into his life on a daily basis in the workplace. So you can see that for Max there was a whole lot that was potentially going on at a fairly deep unconscious level for him. And this is the emotional context in which the pain began for Max. When it began, he struggled with trying to maintain his normal work role. Within a matter of weeks, he had to go on to alternate duties. He struggled to maintain even non-physical duties. The pain became so crippling and disabling for him that he had to leave the workplace, and his GP signed him off as being unfit for work. Max then became a workers' comp person, and he spent the next 5 years being at home, like I said, living only in moving between his bedroom and his couch in his lounge room. So Max described this to me in the third session, and I suggested to him that yes, I did think that the sexual abuse and the associated trauma could be highly related to his experience of chronic pain, and I suggested to him that having his brother turning up in the same workplace at the same time as Max had his first child was a sufficient trigger for the trauma at a fairly deep unconscious level, and that I believe that this could be a causal factor in producing his chronic pain. Max came back a week later. This is the fourth time that I met him, and he reported to me something incredibly remarkable. He reported that he was no longer in pain. So after 5 years of being basically crippled by intense back pain, all of which was under no control of his whatsoever, Max reported that he had a week after discussing with me the sexual abuse and learning that this could be related to his chronic pain. Over the course of the days, the pain diminished, left him in degrees, until he got to the point by the second half of the week that he simply wasn't in pain. And being not in pain, he could kick a ball with his children, he could play with them, he could hold them. He reported that he was able to mow the lawn and he was able to cut a hedge. None of these activities were possible for him in the previous 5 years. Now, this is the quickest recovery from chronic pain that I'd ever seen. I've since seen one or two other very quick recoveries like this, but basically we're talking about, over the space of a week, a pain that had crippled this man for 5 years and was looking like it had the potential to cripple him for the rest of his life, resolved within the space of a week. And needless to say, he was extremely happy. He was no longer depressed, and obviously I was extremely happy as well with this outcome. And Max continued in the subsequent sessions that I saw him. He continued to remain pain-free. The other interesting thing about this was that he actually never chose to do anything about his psychological trauma. Beyond telling me that the sexual abuse had happened, we never actually worked with the trauma associated with that abuse. Now, the importance of that was probably revealed about a month or 6 weeks later, I got a phone call from Max. He'd been pain-free for all this time. I think it was around 6 weeks. And needless to say, he was extremely happy with this. But I got a phone call from him saying that the pain had started to come back again. So I suggested that he come in the following week. And when I met with him the following week, he revealed that the auntie, who he used to spend every second weekend with throughout his childhood, being the only place that he was safe from the sexual abuse, had died. Now, it occurred to me while he was telling me this that his auntie had represented to him the only safe place in his life, was the only place that he was safe from the sexual abuse from his brother. And of course, he had very, very fond feelings towards her. So beyond just being the natural grief that would go along with this kind of loss, I think basically the loss of the auntie as being the person that represented his safety had re-triggered his trauma, and at a fairly deep unconscious level, all of a sudden he felt less secure and less safe than what he had felt while she was alive. And as a result, his chronic pain, well, actually no longer chronic, but his pain in his back began to re-emerge. We discussed this possibility in the session. When I saw him the following week, he reported that his pain had gone away again, which was again highly welcome for him. Now, over the course of the next couple of months, he remained pain-free. A couple of months later, I got another phone call from him saying that the pain was beginning to come back again. So again, we made another appointment for him to come in. And when I met with him again, he revealed that he was now around 3 months of being pain-free. His life was going very well. He was able to do the kind of things that he wanted to do as a father and as a husband. He was extremely happy with all that. And he'd revealed to his GP that he'd been pain-free for this 3-month period. And his GP was saying, well, yeah, that's fantastic. I'm extremely pleased to hear this for you. What it means, however, is that I can't keep on signing you off as being unfit for work. If you're physically fit for work, as you're telling me that you are, and I believe that you are, then I can't keep on writing out medical certificates declaring you as being unfit for work. Now, the problem that this created for Max was that he'd been such a good employee that at the time when he had to leave his workplace, his boss had said to him, your job will always be here for you if you ever get over this pain, your job is always here. And this remained an ongoing promise for Max. And the GP knew this as well. And it meant that with the GP being unable to keep on signing him off as being unfit for work, and the job still being available for him, Max had to go back to the same workplace. And the problem was, of course, that his brother was still in the same workplace. So Max was now faced with the proposition of perhaps having to go back to being in regular daily contact with his brother. And this is a proposition that filled him with no joy whatsoever, that he dreaded. And the dilemma was that he either went back to the workplace with his brother, or he was then, how can I phrase it, at the mercy of government benefits. Now, he was not going to be eligible for a disability pension through the government benefits if there was a job available for him, in which the GP, the treating GP, was saying that he's able to do. This would make Max ineligible for a disability support pension. And he was also going to be ineligible for unemployment benefits because there was a job that was available for him and he was choosing to not do it. Now, this meant that Max either had to go back to the same workplace and see his brother again on a daily basis, or he had to take his family through financial hardship of looking for alternative work, but being ineligible for any form of government financial assistance. looking for new work or looking for retraining. Now, trying to run a family without any source of income whatsoever was an extreme difficult proposition for Max and his family. But of course, this had to be weighed up against the prospect of going back to the same workplace where he was going to be confronted with his abuser again on a daily basis. And of course, that was posing an extreme difficult proposition for him as well. Now, in discussing all this with his wife, Max and his wife worked out that it would be best for him to do some retraining, to go back to some vocational training, to be equipped to then seek work in an alternative workplace rather than having to go back to the same workplace where his brother was. So with his wife's support, he chose to do that, and in a way that solved his dilemma. As a result of working that out, his pain again went away. So again, what we see is that there were several experiences for Max which cropped up again over the course of the treatment, which led to renewed flare-ups of the pain. And I think he remained vulnerable to this kind of experience primarily because he chose not to work with the trauma of the sexual abuse. I think had he chosen to work with that trauma and resolve the trauma, then I think he would have been far less vulnerable to the flare-ups. But this case really presents what's possible for people, and it shows the kind of experiences which can produce chronic pain on a reoccurring basis, and it sort of shows the psychological vulnerability that a sufferer of chronic pain can be in, primarily as a result of choosing to not address the trauma that is underlying the chronic pain. Now, I think we're probably ready for a break. When we come back from the break, I'm going to present to you the actual model of how psychological factors can both produce and maintain chronic pain. And we're going to go into that into a fair degree of detail. So we'll see you again after 10 minutes or so.